You know that Senator Byrd has passed, and last year, so did Thomas Young. He was trapped in that bed for over 10 years. He sustained a pulmonary embolism, discovered in a coma in bed on a certain morning, and he was taken to the VA and they gave him pills. He lost control. He couldn't use his opposable thumb. He would dial a phone with his knuckles, and he couldn't feed himself. His wife, Claudia, would, on the rare occasions when he got out, would look for a dark corner of a restaurant so she could feed him without being stared at. Thomas and Claudia moved to Seattle, actually to Portland, and then to Seattle in the van she drove. And he died there late last year. And this experience was a spiritual experience for everybody who worked on the film. We had never seen a catastrophic injury so up close before. And it's just unspeakable how awful this is. Thomas went from a life of singles bars to living in an inert body in bed. After the pulmonary embolism, he had a colostomy, which, as you know, puts a bag on the side of the body to receive body waste. And he was fed by his wife, Claudia, who stayed with him, and every time I called, she answered. Pardon me, she was there. And she would feed this pureed nutrient through a portal in his abdomen. And so he couldn't consume food orally. And of course, all the commercials on television were for food, delicious food. This is what President Bush never saw. Rumsfeld never saw it. Wolfowitz never saw this. I was at his home, seated next to his bed, and he was in his wheelchair next to the bed, not unlike in the opening scene. And his wife, who was a size 4, would reach around almost like the prelude to a kiss, and grasp his belt in the back. Before that, she would put his hands on her shoulders. He had some control of his hands. And in a burst of energy, just lift him up and literally toss him on the bed where he would bounce like a rag doll. And I sat there, I didn't move. And I thought, the tough guys who want to prove they're tough by having a war and will send your kids to fight it never see this. They never see what's happening in so many countless homes around this nation, occupied by people who did make the sacrifice, who answered the call of the president, which is what Thomas did. He saw the president on the pile, and he wanted to get the evildoers as well. I'm left with I can't believe that I've been so naive for so long. How easy it is to take an entire nation into war, Norman Solomon has written a book titled War Made Easy, in which he makes the point that if a president wants a war, he can have one. Millions of Americans believe it's unpatriotic to criticize a president when he's calling a war. Why would you embarrass a president when he's gearing up to protect us? What does that say to the enemy? There are 1,000 ways that we walk around our responsibility as citizens to speak up. We sent thousands and thousands of young men and women to foreign lands to fight and die to protect our way of life, at the center of which is free speech. If we're not going to use it at this critical time, then let's stop wasting their blood. We'll get a neo-Mussolini and he'll tell us what's good for us. Dissent is very, very difficult in this nation of flag pins. And, you know, the events in Washington don't have one flag, they have 50. You know, it looks like wallpaper. You know, I believe the flag should stand alone, like a sentry. Like the lone eagle, which is another of our national symbols. So much of our breastbeating about the last remaining superpower, the most powerful nation on earth. Exceptionalism, exceptionalism. And I believe patriotism is important. But I think occasionally it's rising to the level of jingoism. And it becomes meaningless, really, if we don't exercise these fabulous rights encoded for us in the Constitution. We stood there while the Bill of Rights has been totally chipped away. I mean, we have prisoners in cages for 10, 12 years and more. No Red Cross, no phone calls, no nothing. They're detainees. Therefore, that's okay? I mean, we're using language to forgive ourselves for the behavior this nation is exercising around the world. If a Marine goes into a house in Fallujah and blows the family away, that's a war crime. If we drop a bomb and incinerate the entire family in their homes, that's collateral damage. We are dropping bombs on crowded cities at night where old people and children are sleeping. We are sending drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, which one of the congressmen stood to say that Saddam had. Saddam didn't have any unmanned aerial vehicles. So a man sits in a cage thousands of miles away in front of a TV monitor and a joystick, and we are killing children. And a wedding party. And this is happening on Obama's watch. No advice and consent. No respect for the demand of the Constitution. We're killing people in other places. We are a nation of law unless we're scared. And until enough of us awaken to believe, as I've come to see with the making of this film, the brilliance of the framers. The framers were right. The framers were right about the separation of church and state. God is very, very popular in this country. And alas, he's being used to support a decision to go to war far too often. We go to war more often. We go to war more often for the Prince of Peace than for any other reason. And we don't somehow seem to have any interest in self-reflection. Who are we? We're spending $2 billion a day on things that go boom. We have over 100,000 people with security clearance. You can't have security if 100,000 people have the secret. What are they? And Jim Risen of the New York Times makes the case that, there are all kinds of businesses, for-profit businesses. Our security spying agencies are farmed out. These aren't government employees. These are people who are hired by private companies. And there's a whole bunch of them north of Washington, D.C. And if peace suddenly broke out, these thousands of people would not be able to feed their families. So as our technology increases, and as the money we have over 800, I'm good at telling people what they already know, I'm sorry. But it bears saying out loud. We have about 800 military installations around the world. And those installations are often occupied by men, usually men, who are behaving very badly. The rape of a young teenage girl in Okinawa. A United States Air Force jet out of Aviano in Italy, in a cowboy maneuver, flew under the cable of a ski lodge tram occupied by 21 people. The tail of the airplane struck the cable, severed it, and 21 people trapped in what amounted to a coffee can plummeted to the ground, rolled down the mountain, and killed all of the people inside. The plane, somehow, with a damaged tail, returned to base. And a giant effort was made to cover up the incident. These are incidents detailed by Chalmers Johnson, who recently passed, emeritus professor at the University of California, San Diego. He wrote what is called the Blowback series, in which he details all the irreverent and often antisocial and often criminal behavior enacted by American military personnel. So we enter now into the 21st century, and we have to ask ourselves, is all this making us safer? And if we can send a drone to a foreign country and incinerate somebody in an automobile, why can't they do that to us? And at least, and I understand the attraction of drones. Drones means you don't have to risk American blood. But there should be a limit. I think drones with incendiary devices should be a war crime. And so I should pass out the pills to make you feel better. This is hardly but I couldn't help. I mean, the tone of my remarks is really triggered by the 4 years that I spent making this film. And by the way, we won lots of awards. We were on a short list for an Oscar. We won the Documentary of the Year from the National Film Board of Review, and we sold no popcorn. This is not a take your girl to the movie. And it's an example of how tough it is. I guess I knew when I got into this that this wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wasn't. But at least we didn't embarrass ourselves, and the film still has legs, and we get in front of some very large audiences of people of conscience. And I know that many of them are moved to do something to bring our nation back to the vision of the framers. I know you join me in that grand wish, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
I'm going to move on to our next two panelists. William Hartung. There is likely no more knowledgeable speaker anywhere on the issue of arms sales, weapons, and how the weapons industry drives our wars than William Hartung. He is the author of Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. He was the co-author of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War. Mr. Hartung was the director of the Arms and Security Initiative at the New American Foundation, and prior to that, he was the director of the Arms Trade Resource Center, a World Policy Institute. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post. He's a national security expert, has appeared on CBS 60 Minutes, CNN, NewsHour, and many, many other media outlets. Joining him will be Danielle Bryan. She is the executive director of Project for Government Oversight, which works to expose overspending by government agencies, which sounds to me like a full-time job. She frequently testifies before Congress and meets with members of the White House staff and others to find ways to make government more accountable, open, and ethical. Ms. Bryan was also appointed to the by the Secretary of the Interior to serve on the U.S. Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Federal Advisory Committee. I'm not making this up. I don't know what that is, but I hope she'll tell us. Ms. Bryan serves on the board of Taxpayers for Common Sense and is chair of the steering committee for OpenTheGovernment.org. Their topic is going to be defective defense. Please welcome William Hartung and Danielle Bryan.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank Ralph, Veterans for Peace, all the organizers. It's an honor to be on the panel with Danielle and to come after all the great speakers that we've had today. I've been talking about this issue for a long time, and what I used to do is I would paint a very bleak picture of the powerful behemoth that is the military-industrial complex. And then people would come up to me and say, God, it really is hopeless, Bill. I'm going home. So I'm going to shorten that part. And to say that we can make a difference. We have made a difference. We've been working in smaller numbers in recent years, but I think people should take credit for the fact that we've stuck with it. We've kept these issues alive. And I think we're entering a period where there'll be an upsurge of activism on our issues and where we'll make greater victories. Not that it won't be bumpy along the way. So our panel is defective defense. And I guess the question is, why is it defective? Who benefits from it being defective? And how much money is at stake? And And I think you'll find, if you read some of the publications of the organizations that spoke prior, a lot of the money that's spent on the Pentagon has nothing to do with defending anybody, and a lot of it, were it ever used, would end life as we know it. So how much money is at stake? Well, the Pentagon and related agencies like nuclear warheads at the Department of Energy, the war budget, which is a huge slush fund for the Pentagon, you put that together, you're already over $600 billion a year. Then if you look at related things like Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, military aid, the military-related interest on the debt, you push up more towards $1 trillion. And part of the problem we have is these sums are so huge that people have no way to get their arms around them. So one way to look at it, among others, is if you waited for 1 million seconds to do something, that would be 12 days. If you waited 1 billion seconds, it would be 31 years. And if you waited 1 trillion seconds, it would be 31,000 years. So I wouldn't wait if I were you. You know, other ways of looking at it, Ron Klain, who was President Obama's ombudsman to deal with the Ebola crisis, had a piece in the Washington Post talking about the obscene debate in Congress over whether we have enough money to address the Zika virus, acting as if somehow we don't. And he pointed out that the amount they were arguing over is about 7 days worth of Pentagon spending. So, you know, the money is there, we just have to put it in the right place. Another way to look at it is the Department of State, which should be our lead agency in the international arena, gets only 1/12 as much money as the Pentagon. And that's before you add all those other related activities. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates pointed out there are more personnel in an aircraft carrier task force, of which the United States has 11, than there are trained diplomats in the entire U.S. State Department. So that gives you some sense of how tilted the priorities are. Now, there's many reasons given for this, but one of the sort of arguments of last resort is always jobs. You know, sure, we'd love to change these policies, but there's millions of jobs at stake, and therefore we can't do it. You know, first off, I would say, if we took that approach to everything, nothing would ever change, literally. And we certainly can't afford to do it in this area. But the other thing that the people who use this argument don't want people to know is that Pentagon spending is the worst possible way to create jobs. If you invested in infrastructure, you know, say like a DC Metro that worked, if you invested in alternative energy, which we desperately need, any money going into any of these other areas would create 1.5 times as many jobs as spending on weapon systems. And if we had the leadership to do that and the training for those people who are building weapons to move into other areas, that problem could be solved. But of course, it's going to be a big fight, but I think it's a fight that has to be had. So I think of the Pentagon budget as a job killer, not a job creator, because it's sucking money from things that would create many more jobs. Now, of course, we talked about the role of Congress, and people mentioned the military-industrial congressional complex. And I was watching the debate on the House floor the other day of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is not a popular hobby, I have to say, based on my informal surveys. But I was watching it, and suddenly amendment after amendment to do these ridiculous things kept coming up. And I said, what is up with this? So I started Googling each member who had a ridiculous idea to figure out whether the issue they were talking about related to a company in their state or district. And after 3 in a row, I sort of stopped, because it was clear this was almost the rule when it came to spending on weapon systems, that it was all about money in the district for companies that have jobs there, that provide contributions to the member, and so forth. So one particularly egregious one, there was a member from Arkansas who wanted to take money from a good program, a program that is used to lock down nuclear materials and bomb-making materials so they can't get in the hands of terrorists or other people who might use them. Now, of course, nobody should have nuclear weapons in their hands. We understand that. But we certainly don't want them to spread further to groups that might use them in a terrorist attack. So this program is designed to prevent that from happening, as opposed to waiting to see what happens and then saying we need more money for Star Wars, which is what this money was going to a missile defense program built in Camden, Arkansas, which was in this member's district. So he was able to take money from a useful program that might prevent the use of nuclear weapons, put it in a useless, overfunded missile defense program, and get away with it. And this kind of thing happens all the time. There's a little wrinkle in this year's budget debate, which if it seems arcane, it's because it is, and it's because they're trying to keep us from understanding how they're using our money. But for years now, they've taken the war budget, which is not subject to budget caps, and they've thrown everything in the kitchen sink in there that the Pentagon or some member wants. So it's a slush fund for their pet projects. It has nothing to do with supplying the troops on the front lines. So this year, Mac Thornberry, who's awash in Pentagon contracts in his state and heads the House Armed Services Committee, said, well, let's borrow, say, $18 billion from this war fund and spend it on F-35s, which are built in Texas, F-18s, which are built in Missouri, a whole laundry list of projects. And this was beyond what the Pentagon even asked for. And then he said, well, and then, if we run out of money for the troops, let the next president worry about it, And this is the same guy who is saying, we're not taking care of our troops, they can't be trained, they're looking for spare parts in museums. And of course, he's taking billions and billions of dollars that could be used for those purposes to spend on weapons that the Pentagon hasn't even asked for. So there's sort of the small fraud and the bigger fraud, but it's all, in many cases, about taking care of the military-industrial congressional complex in one form or another. And these companies cash in to an obscene degree. I did a book about Lockheed Martin, which is the world's largest military contractor. And they get $30 to $40 billion in Pentagon contracts in what for them is a good year, and for us, obviously, is a bad year. And that's more than most federal agencies get. It's more than the operating part of the State Department's budget. And then if you look at some of the big programs, like the F-35 combat aircraft, that's supposed to cost $1.4 trillion over its lifetime. There goes that trillion again. It seems to be kind of a natural number for the Pentagon. And so that amount of money, the $1.4 trillion, would make it the 13th largest economy in the world, just ahead of Spain. Now, I don't know if you'd want to live in a country that was entirely made up of F-35s, but it's just another sense of how much money is being wasted in this regard. And I think, maybe biggest of all, and this has been mentioned several times and can't be mentioned enough, there's a plan to spend $1 trillion on new nuclear bombers, new nuclear weapons armed submarines, new intercontinental ballistic missiles, additional money for the whole nuclear warhead complex, which is run by the Department of Energy. None of that money needs to be spent. And I think, as was mentioned, it would be very fitting if the president were to come back from Hiroshima and put a hold on those programs. And of course, he's not going to do that without a lot of pressure. But I think it's well worth demanding. So that's a little bit of the inner workings of the military-industrial complex. But I wanted to talk about how even under quite difficult circumstances, we've been able to win some victories. And I expect there to be more to come as we involve more people in these efforts. A couple years ago, the Pentagon decided it wanted to stop buying the F-22 combat aircraft, which cost about $200 million a pop at minimum, and was not clear what they would ever use it for. Lockheed Martin said, oh no, we need another 100 of these. The Air Force said, oh no, we need another 100 of these. And it was just assumed if you teamed up Lockheed Martin and the Air Force, it was case closed. They were going to get their planes. But a coalition came together, including groups like POGO, I worked a bit on it, Women's Action for New Directions, Peace Action, and others. And in this case, even the president was against building this thing. And when push came to shove, Lockheed Martin lost that vote in the Senate, despite the fact that they used the jobs argument, despite the fact that they spread all their money around for lobbying, despite the fact that they give campaign contributions. It was such a bad idea that even they couldn't get away with it. And more recently, and this is probably not well known, but as I mentioned before, there are caps on the Pentagon budget going back to the Budget Control Act of a few years ago. And they've got all kinds of ways to try to get around it. But nonetheless, because of those caps, they've probably gotten a couple $100 billion less than they expected to get. And also, if it weren't for the efforts of some of the people in this room, they would have put caps on the domestic budget and let the Pentagon go scot-free. So a number of us were part of that effort to cap the Pentagon budget. And there was pushback from the industry, and once again, the job argument reared its head. And the Aerospace Industries Association sponsored a bogus study, which was basically 5 pages of assertions, that said that we'd lose 1 million jobs if the budget caps stayed in place. So they stayed in place, they did some finagling, but in essence they stayed in place. Employment increased. We need better jobs, there's no question about it, but those 1 million jobs did not disappear. And it got to the point where even some of the members of Congress said, I don't believe these guys anymore, get out of my office, which is a pretty amazing thing in the history of congressional weapons contractor relations. And then, of course, we had the Iran deal, which the industry was sort of more in the background on that. It was more of an issue of groups like AIPAC, of Netanyahu coming to speak to Congress, of a whole ideology of demonization, which feeds back into, of course, the arguments for why we need to spend more on the Pentagon. So, I think what we need to do is, there's sort of 2 pieces of it. Some people say, well, the peace movement disappeared. I don't see it that way. I think those of us who stuck with it have done an important service and should be proud of what we've done, because I think we kept these issues alive for the moment when they can take off again, where we can build a bigger coalition and we can make a bigger difference. And sometimes the people who fight in the trenches when the odds are the worst are the ones who deserve the most credit. And I'm not speaking about myself, but many people in the audience here. And we have to strengthen our base as well as reach out. So groups like FCNL and Women's Action for New Directions and Peace Action and Code Pink and Veterans for Peace need our support in whatever way possible. Is it money? Is it our time? Is it, as Jim Kaysen said earlier, spreading these messages to people we don't normally talk to, don't normally agree with, to change the conversation? I think there's a lot we can do to get that ripple effect moving again. And I think when we do that, all that concentrated power in the hands of these companies is not going to be enough to stop us. And that's certainly why I do this, and I believe that. Otherwise, I'd be, on a sailboat in the Bahamas or something like that. Except I can't afford it. So anyway, that's what I had to say for now. And Danielle and I may kick some of these issues around later, but first we're going to hear from her.
Thank you, Bill. And to give a little context for my organization, the Project on Government Oversight, we began in 1981, which we're actually about to celebrate our 35th anniversary, as the Project on Military Procurement. And we were created by whistleblowers inside the Pentagon who were concerned about the control defense contractors had on policy, the fact that they were getting away with all kinds of, the $7,600 coffee pot and the $36 hammer, as well as sending soldiers off to war with weapons that didn't work when they got there, because it wasn't about helping the soldiers at all. It was about padding the pockets of the contractors. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Bill was talking about, specifically that F-22 fight. The more I think about it, the more I think it's important to get into some of the details on what happened there, because there's generally an assumption, I think, and I know this is an audience of well-informed, people, But there's generally an assumption that when politicians describe themselves as progressive or democratic, that they're going to be on your side on these issues, but the F-22 fight was one that sort of helped to illustrate how that wasn't the case. And so that was in 2009, and it was just at the beginning when we were using the internet as an important tool for communications and advocacy. And what we were doing was going to every office and finding out which way that senator was going to vote on this particular vote on canceling the production line of the F-22. We knew that there were, I think, 38 senators who agreed with both Secretary Gates, who had been the Secretary both for Secretary of Defense both for Bush and Obama, and Senators McCain and Levin, the chair and ranking of the Senate Armed Services Committee, were all saying we should be canceling this program. But as Bill said, the lobbyists, not just for Lockheed, but all the subcontractors as well, were all over the Pentagon, all over the Congress trying to stop this vote from happening. So we started going office by office and asking, it turned out Democrats were our biggest issue, because the Democrats, many of them, were hoping to be able to vote in favor of the program without a lot of scrutiny. And it was I think it's a great victory for as Bill is saying, for our community, where we at POGO were actually putting up on our blog when we'd call an office and a Democrat was admitting that they were planning to vote for it. They weren't used to this. We put it up on the blog, on the internet. And then the organizations, also the defense budget priorities as well. I mean, there's a number of coalition groups that then went out to the grassroots and went to those members' constituents to let them know that this was happening. And it was that great combination of inside game from Washington and outside back in the field to hold these people accountable who wanted to call themselves sort of good progressives, but they were continuing to vote for the weapons for all the reasons that we'll talk about. So I think it's important to know that, and because we're going to see those kinds of things happening again and again and again. So on the jobs argument, and Bill is right, that has been one of the central arguments, and that's one that, labor, which is of course an important part of this community, has often been arguing in favor of increased defense spending because of the jobs. But what is important to realize now is that over half of the money that's spent on defense contracts is not manufacturing jobs. It is white-collar jobs. It's IT, it's professional management services, it's project management. I don't even understand why you need to hire contractors to do project management, but that's where a huge amount of this money is going. If you're going out to Tyson's Corner, or you drive up 270, or out to Dulles Airport, and you see all of those buildings, those are all defense contractors. Those are not factories. Those are white-collar jobs, and that's where the defense budget is going. Another thing that's important to know is over half the money that is spent on defense contracts is not awarded through competition. So those who believe in the free market, there's no free market when it comes to the defense budget. This is something it's a deal that's made for the companies there on the inside. It is very important to realize the influence both on the defense budget spending decisions as well as foreign policy decisions that these defense contractor lobbyists are having. So while there may have been conversations earlier about the role that campaign contributions play by defense contractors in giving contributions to politicians, that's only 1/5 the amount of money that these contractors are spending on lobbying. So it's a really important number. About last year, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, $25 million was spent by defense contractors in campaign contributions, which is not okay, but that is a chunk of money. But $127 million is being spent by the same companies to have their people up on Capitol Hill telling Congress people how to vote, giving them the position papers, drafting speeches for them. And that is an incredibly important way that that industry is influencing policy. So that is part of, I see all of this as different types of corruption, frankly. And so there's illegal corruption and there's legal corruption. So you may have heard of a couple of examples of illegal corruption, just so you can sort of see the comparisons. One of them, how many remember the name Duke Cunningham? Because it's one of the most shocking stories, right? I mean, it's an unbelievable story. This was a guy in the House who actually, I don't know that a camera can take a picture of this, but he wrote this was on his congressional notepad with his name on it. And there's numbers down the side here. These are for millions of dollars that would be for a contract that a contractor could get if they gave him this much money in campaign contribution. And the number at the top for what he would get was for a BT, and it turned out in the prosecution, the guy went to jail, so it's a happy ending here. But BT was buoy toy, because he wanted to at least be able to get a boat, and then you get 50,000 more for each $1 million more you get in a defense contract. So that's illegal corruption, and he went to jail. Another example was Darlene Druyan, who was an Air Force official who was making arrangements for Boeing to get special deals while she was negotiating not only a job for herself, but a job for her daughter and for her son-in-law. And she ultimately went to jail. But it's important actually to know that the way the revolving door rules work currently, she was going to be allowed to go to Boeing, even though it was very clearly established that she was working on Boeing contracts. But they're saying, no, she's working on the missile division for Boeing, so it's okay if she goes to work for the aircraft division of Boeing when she leaves, which is a ridiculous distinction. But see, this is where I'm getting to this question of legal and illegal corruption. So what she actually did caused her to go to jail, but in theory, she would have legally been able to do that. So one of the things that's so concerning to us is how many things are still absolutely allowed. So when you talk about this revolving door, here's an example that I cannot believe is legal. But there was a Deputy Secretary of Defense during the previous Clinton administration. His name was Pete Aldrich. He sat on a board that made a decision. Again, we're going to talk about the F-22. He was chairing the committee that made the decision that we were going to go ahead in the very beginning of that program to buy the F-22. He was allowed to retire from the Pentagon and go on the board of Lockheed Martin. It's crazy. That's legal. That's legal. The rule only says that he wasn't allowed to get compensated for the first year, but then he was able to get the compensation after that first year. It's a ridiculous situation because the revolving door rules currently only apply to sort of the mid-level people, but not the senior people who I think are the ones who need it most. Another example was a general who was aboard making a decision. You know, when you think about tanks, there are tanks that have wheels and there are tanks that have tracks. There's different, formation. And the Pentagon was making a decision, the Army was making a decision on which way to go, the wheeled vehicles or the tracked vehicles. And this guy was in charge of the policy-making decision. He made the decision. He then goes to work for the company that actually made the wheeled, he was going with the wheeled ones, and that's the one he went to work for. Crazy that he was allowed to do it, and there were no restrictions because they didn't have a contract at the time, that he was overseeing. And the final one that I want to mention is in the Obama administration. Even though President Obama, early in his presidency, issued an ethics pledge that required that there not be a revolving door, he immediately issued a waiver for a Raytheon lobbyist to become the number 2 at the Pentagon, Bill Lynn. So the revolving door is very much alive. There was an analysis that showed that 80% of 3- and 4-star generals go to work for defense contractors. A decade ago, it was fewer than half, and now it's more than 3/4 that do. So why does this matter? There's no incentive to keep costs down or make sure the goods aren't faulty or even argue against war if part of what you're thinking is the people who are benefiting from it might be your future employer. So it's an incredibly important legalized corruption to get a hold of. And one of the things that Bill and I have talked a lot about is one of the worst ways that this happens is the revolving door to think tanks. So going back to the movie that Phil was showing us earlier and the politicians that are encouraged to go to war. As you know, this city is now filled with pundits, think tanks and academics who are on television, who are writing magazine articles in favor of certain foreign policy interventions. Look at who is paying those, who is funding those think tanks. It is extraordinary how much influence the defense industry has been able to incur in the last decade by funding, standing up, in fact, in many cases, entire organizations, think tanks, nonprofit groups with sort of benign sounding names, but are really just mouthpieces for pro-war and pro-spending. And what you'll see is there's also that revolving door from the think tanks back into the government as well. All of it, again, funded by these defense contractors. And the last thing I want to mention is the critical voice of whistleblowers in the military and intelligence and defense community, and the desperately troublesome prosecution of these whistleblowers. I know that you'll be hearing from some of them, I think, later today during this administration. These are people who are on the inside trying to be our conscience for us, and they are suffering not just with their career often, and that has got to change. They're currently, even though there have been advancements in whistleblower protections in many areas, when it comes to military and intelligence, especially intelligence contractors, these are essentially people without any serious protections. So what do? Don't let politicians get away with it just because they say that they're good guys. Really figure out how they're voting on these things. Protect whistleblowers. There's a lot that I'm hoping you are the people who are actually going to town halls and communicating with candidates or incumbents for office. Ask them, what are they going to do about the revolving door? What are they going to do about the contractor pay to play? How are we going to fix this? Hold their feet to the fire. They know there are organizations that work on these issues and want to stop it, but let them know that you care about these issues too. And finally, just remember that more money does not mean more security, and it is not about the troops. It's about padding people's pockets. So I just wanted to check in with you now and see if there's things that we've left off that we should be exploring a little bit more.
Sure, there always are. Well, you know, the whole think tank thing reminded me of a few cases. There's this guy, Frank Gaffney, who was advising Ted Cruz. I think he's sort of leaning towards Trump now, surprisingly enough. And he's a major league Islamophobe. This is his whole purpose in life now. But when he was in the Reagan administration, he was a big proponent of Star Wars. And he was such a hawk, he got kicked out of the Reagan Pentagon. If you can imagine
right?
that. And so he started this thing called the Center for Security Policy. Again, one of these neutral names.
Yeah.
Which was a full-time lobbying public education outfit for Star Wars. And of course, his donors were Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, all the companies that were going to cash in on this. So I used to cross swords in a nonviolent way with Mr. Gaffney now and again. And I kept pointing out, which he never would say, that he was getting all this money from weapons contractors. And so finally he wrote a letter to the New York Times. He says, oh, this is not true. I take money from all kinds of corporations, not just weapons contractors. So this is the kind of thing that we run into. And it's so common that a reporter contacted me a while back. He wanted to talk about think tanks that don't take money from Pentagon contractors.
We don't.
So, you know, he called me, he called Danielle, a few other people. And, you know, and the story just disappeared. And I asked him what happened. He said, well, it's so common, my boss didn't think it was news, so we didn't run the story.
Isn't that tragic? I mean, actually, it's really important for you to know that there are very, very few organizations that work on defense and military issues that don't take money from defense contractors. And of course, none of them would be working on this panel, of course. but in Washington, it is extraordinary how often. There's another example. I'm thinking of a writer named Lauren Thompson, who for years was able to get away with writing as though he was just thoughtful and really just cared about these things, until we were able to track down that he was being paid. I think at that time it was by Lockheed, and now that's one of the things that's also important for you. When you're reading a pundit who sounds like they're clearly on the take, they probably are, and push back with the publication and make sure that the publication is identifying who these op-ed writers, who they're getting paid by, because that's an essential thing that he now, the Washington Post anyway, identifies him as an industry, some industry-funded academic.
Shill.
Yeah.
But they don't use that term in the Washington Post. Well, the thing about somebody like Thompson is he lobbies for so many different weapons companies that occasionally he's got his own internal conflict of interest. Because Company A and Company B are actually vying for a contract. And he's got to figure out what to do, you know, and I feel for the guy, you know.
But I mean, it's important as we think about issues of war and peace to recognize that that these questions of war and peace are behind the scenes really a big business. And there's so many jobs now that have been created simply to promote the idea of the need for new weapons, the need for new intervention, and so much of these desperately important policies are being skewed because of the financial interests of a universe of people.
Entirely. When Eisenhower gave his military-industrial complex speech, before he did it, one of the things that really bugged him was these defense companies taking out ads on behalf of their programs. Some of them were in, like industry things like Aviation Week and space technology that's not on your kitchen table. But some were in the New York Times and other places. And of course, they were using government money that they were getting in contracts to turn around and buy ads to influence the government, try to blackmail people like Eisenhower into doing things like building a new bomber, which he did not want to do. So it was, that kind of thing just got under his skin. And it was, it's just one small type of influence that is used. But even back then, this stuff had up a head of steam. I would say the difference now is maybe the companies are more sophisticated, so they use more different tools of influence, perhaps, than they did back then. But I think, nonetheless, the more you can expose the connection between these companies and the policymakers, the easier it is to explain why these terrible policies persist. Right. It's not the only reason. Obviously, there's kind of an ideology. There's the American exceptionalism. Matt Ho talked about this idea that the United States would only possibly intervene anywhere for altruistic purposes. So there's a lot of misconceptions and ideology that go into it. But this money issue is kind of the bedrock. It's sort of beyond which you cannot go. And if we don't deal with that, very hard to dismantle this complex, which I think we desperately need to do.
And tragically, in the political discourse of the presidential election, it's nowhere to be seen. I mean, the closest you get is Bernie Sanders, who will talk about the fact that the Pentagon needs to be audited, and the fact that the Pentagon is the only government agency that actually cannot pass an audit, which is preposterous, but continues to be true. But it's an outrage that we are still at war, and there is this question of even keeping the current obscenely high caps on defense spending, and it's just not a part of the conversation at the presidential level.
And I think we can try to do something about that. American Friends Service Committee had a project called Governing Under the Influence, which they mostly ran in New Hampshire and Iowa. And they basically went around and asked candidates about corporate influence of various sorts, everything from nuclear weapons to privatized prisons. And it was like a precision operation. I was going to say a military operation, but it was the Friends, so obviously it was not. But they kept schedules of all the meetings, which one you need an invite to get in, which one can you just show up at. They coached their questions. They videotaped all their questions so they could put them up on the web. Perhaps the most hilarious one was when the guy asked Donald Trump if he was against crony capitalism. He said, "Oh, of course. I am completely against crony capitalism, except when it applies to me, of course." But one of them got Hillary Clinton on a rope line in Iowa and said, do we really need to spend $1 trillion on next generation nuclear weapons? And she said, that doesn't sound right to me. I'm going to look into that. So
she's right. It doesn't sound right, but it is what it is.
That's the little hook that people's hard work got, was that she was on the record acknowledging the truth in front of a significant number of people about the fact that we don't need these nuclear weapons. And I think the thing is, we have to be relentless about it. But I think there's various ways to use the campaign, as absurd as it is, to educate on some of these issues.
And demand, I think that the reality is as obvious that the media is not going to ask the questions. We've had all these debates and none of them have been about these issues. And so it's up to us as citizen activists to be asking the questions at town halls and writing. And I mean, I have been told that 6 phone calls into a congressional office actually has an impact. 6 phone calls, that's not that many. I mean, I know that people have come to believe that if it's just, an email or the same letter that's copied because a great organization has published it and you send it in, that it doesn't have as much impact. It still matters. But the phone call, they know that people are nervous making a phone call to a congressional office, and so it takes a certain level of an extra level of effort to do it. So just think about that. If you can get 5 of your friends to all call, it's going to get noticed in that office.
The other thing about doing this for a long time is it's easy to get discouraged. And so I think the rule should be, for every minute you spend grumbling to your friends about how screwed up the world is, you got to spend 5 minutes saying positive things to other people about how we can change it. I think that would be a good ratio to try to work towards. I'm not saying I'm there yet. I'm just saying I think it's a good goal.
I do want to also note something that Bill said earlier about we were very close a few years ago when the first Budget Control Act was passing and this question of sequestration was happening. It was almost a foregone conclusion that the other side was going to win, and defense spending was not going to be under these caps. And it was really only because of activism that it is under the same caps as domestic spending. So I am outraged that we're spending as much as we are, but it could have been so much worse. And sometimes we have to realize, that it's not just that we didn't get what we want, but we stopped something absolutely awful from almost happening.
And we're sort of running down, but I would also say we are going to get what we want if we keep working on these things and working hard and bringing more people in. And I'm so thankful that you're all here and that this conference is happening. And
Me too. Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening to us.
Senator Jeffords, the one that switched sides of the aisle.
He's one of my heroes, too.
Mr. Jeffords, no.
Kennedy, Leahy, and Levin.
Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Levin, no, no, no.
McCoskey,
Ms. Mikulski, no.
Murray.
Mrs. Murray,
Patty Murray.
no.
Reed from Rhode Island. Sarbanes.
Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Sarbanes, no.
Stabenow?
Yeah, Debbie Stabenow.
Ms. Stabenow, no.
Wellstone, that's the man who gave his life shortly thereafter.
And then Wyden.
And Wyden, he's still here.
Mr. Wellstone, no. Mr. Wyden, no.
23. 77 to 23. The immortal 23. Our founders, we'd be so proud. Thank you for your service. Man, you've made a great sacrifice. You served your country well.
As of you, sir.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Where do you go next now?
I don't know. I'm not in charge of my day.
That's the way I feel sometimes. I'm not in charge of mine.